This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 229 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's topic is living abroad versus travelling abroad. What is the big difference about actually living somewhere? Now, apparently I talk about this quite a lot. I keep bumping into people who say they've listened to the podcast and then they'll say something like, oh, you used to live in Slovakia, or, oh, you were living in Japan, weren't you? So I obviously bang on about it a lot, but there's a good reason for that. Those years living abroad were some of the most important and influential and, quite frankly, fun times of my life. So in case you haven't heard me rave on about it, from my mid-20s to my early 30s, I lived overseas, moved away from Australia for a few years. I spent a couple of years in Osaka, Japan, and then a year in Bratislava in Slovakia, and then about 2.5 years in Heilbronn in southwest Germany. So those experiences completely changed my life, and I think about them every day without fail. There's so much living packed into those few years, I think. And I've got to thinking a lot over the years about the differences when you're living somewhere versus travelling somewhere. And so I thought I'd talk to some more people about it. And I got lots of really interesting discussions happening about it. So it's not just me who thinks that living abroad is very, very different to travelling abroad. My first guest today to talk on this subject is Flip Byrnes. And she spoke to me a few months back from Germany, where she still is. But Flip, like me, is an Aussie. And I asked Flip to tell me about her experiences of living away from Australia.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Amanda, but as a travel writer, I couldn't help but always pick up real estate brochures of places that I went to that I particularly liked, and always in the back of my mind, would always be, could I live there? Is this the best place in the world? And just to really fast forward and have a massive spoiler, in my opinion, Australia is the best place in the world to live. So
it is a pretty good spot.
I traveled to it's a great spot, and I've travelled to a lot of other places. I've got a real estate folder that's a stack high from San Sebastian to Wellington, to Queenstown. And there's no place, I still call Australia home. But to give you a brief overview, the first place that I lived as a 22-year-old was Aspen in Colorado. Only meant to go there for a season, but that extended out to 3 years. The second place that I lived was in the French Alps, and that was actually love-related. And my love for the destination has endured far longer than
the relationship.
The relationship. He was a pro skier. Do I need to say anything more? And then the last place has been, I don't know what I'd call this related, due to the fact that my husband's mother was ill. So what would you call that? Like a family relocation due to family circumstances, I guess. So 3 very different reasons. And I think it depends on what do you call living somewhere, because people often say, oh, I lived in, Barcelona. Oh, yes, I've lived in Thailand. And what they might mean is that they were there doing a course for 6 weeks, or maybe, they were there for 3 months for a work transfer. I don't know, Amanda. What do you consider to be living somewhere?
I think it has to be at least a year. I don't know. I have no good reason to say that. It's a completely arbitrary number, but I feel like a year is it.
Yes, I'll agree.
You really get to know a place within a year. I once, when I was living abroad, I had this sad realisation once, because I'd spent 2 years in Japan, and I felt 2 years was like optimum amount, because the first year everything's new, and then the second year when everything happens, like especially like seasonal things and festivals and all of that.
Yes.
And so the second year I had I knew everything. I kind of, I had got a little bit used to life in Japan, and so I thought 2 years. Yeah. And then I was like 27 at the time, and I thought, but there's so many more places I want to live.
And I don't have that many lots of 2 years left. So I just remember being really devastated by thinking 2 years was this optimum time because, the average lifetime doesn't have, that many lots of 2 years, So anyway.
No, and not if you want to put down roots somewhere eventually as well. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, exactly.
And then you really are limited to how many lots of 2 years you've actually got.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is a very different way of seeing a place than just travelling through, for sure.
Yeah, it really is. And one place I would never say that I have lived because I don't qualify within that year that I think we mutually agree is a prerequisite, which I'll now put out on the table at any dinner party. I'll say, sorry, it has been universally acknowledged between Western Australia and today in Germany on this podcast that the international criteria
that is the standard. 1 year. Yes.
1 year, yeah. So I was working on the Rugby World Cup in France in 2011. So the last set of games were in Paris, and somehow I managed to stay there for 6 weeks. I think from different test games and whatever. So it was a 6-week period. And then I just keep finding myself back in Paris over and over again for different things. And so I'd never say that I've lived there. I'd never say that I knew the city like a local. But I've got to the point there that whenever I go, I really have seen everything. And then, as you're saying with Japan, once you've ticked off all the sites, done all the things, you kind of move down to a more local level. Mm-hmm. And so when I go there now, it's almost like Paris for me is a static marker because I've been there as a backpacker, as a worker, when I was pregnant, with my babies, at all these different times in my life. And I always sit down at Notre Dame and always have a chat with her in my head, obviously. I'm not going to sit at Notre Dame and have a talk to myself out loud. But, and it's always kind of just pinpoints where I am at that time in my life. So I can never not go to Paris and not see Notre Dame and just check in as my static marker about where I am. And then it's almost as though the city is haunted for me because I have so many memories of so many street corners. This is where I had coffee with my mum. This is where I got ice cream after, one of the Rugby World Cup games. This is, all these memories just like keep, flooding back as you get when you actually live somewhere, when you walk around your neighbourhood. And I think just because those experiences and memories there over so many years have been so intense because they're heightened by that sense of being away and that excitement of being away, that somehow I go there now not to see things or do things, but I'll usually spend 3 or 4 days a year just going to Paris just to sit in parks, wander around, much like you would kind of if you're a local. So even though I haven't never lived in Paris, I do feel a real connection to that city like a local in some ways.
Flip and I went on to have an even more in-depth conversation about the differences between living abroad and travelling abroad. But then Eva, the journalist, she turned the tables on me and asked me actually a really important question about languages and living in other countries.
And I don't know if you'd agree with this, but, looking at your, being fluent in German and then, speaking some Japanese, and I'm fluent in Italian and speak some French and really no German. How do you feel about being able to speak a language as really colouring your vision of living somewhere? To me, that is a crucial component of feeling like you live somewhere. If you can't talk to the locals in their own language, and linguistics even has their own special ways of understanding the culture as well. There's so much cultural, languages are culturally saturated. So I feel that unless you speak a language, you'll actually never really understand the country that you're living in. Would you agree?
100% true. Because even when you do speak the language fluently, it's still hard to understand, really the culture and
I know.
And even the language sometimes doesn't make sense, even though you understand it. But absolutely, so I feel much more connected to the German culture, I guess, because I can speak German fluently. And it makes a huge difference for sure. So, I think I also think you can't, it's very hard to speak a language fluently without living there. Like they kind of go hand in hand, I think. Like I learned German all through school, but when I got to Germany, I kind of, understood a lot. Actually, I didn't really understand my Swabian neighbours very well. There were all these old Swabian people in my apartment block who spoke with this terribly strong Swabish dialect. I was like, oh, suddenly I can't understand anything. But I did get used to it over time. Yeah, the kind of that marriage of living somewhere and becoming fluent in language, that's when you start to really understand, living in another place, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, because you kind of like get rid of that sense of being an other, inverted commas. But, for all those people, I guess, who, and I'd like your thoughts on this, who think that they'd love to follow, their dreams of living in Mallorca or, living in Santorini or, some other really idyllic spot that they've passed in their holidays and thought, oh, maybe I could live here. I think it's that movie Under a Tuscan Sun, if that's it, where she's a writer and she goes to live, and do up this house. And I think that's a really accurate portrayal of expat life. If she hadn't had those builders there, she would have been one lonely woman. So I think if people have experienced the pandemic and have decided that living by themselves with minimal social interaction is something that they can handle, then maybe they could go and start up, then they can live anywhere. But I think, getting inside a community is a really difficult thing to do. And we're not talking about expat communities, which is easy to do in Bali and Hong Kong and, Paris and these places. But
it's not the same.
If you end up, it's not the same, but if you end up in some place like, talk to our mutual friend Brent Goundwater, who's just been living in San Sebastian and, talking with him, he said that his vision was that they'd be really accepted immediately by their neighbours and their community, and they'd have a local bar and it'd be like that old sitcom Cheers where you walked in and everyone, knew your name and said hola. And he just said they are, so deeply ingrained in their culture and everyone knows each other for generations, and it took them a good part of their time there just to start making friends. So I don't think that living somewhere can be underestimated, the difficulty of it.
It's very true. Living abroad is often not very easy, but the rewards are so intense that it's well and truly worth it, and I think lots of people would agree. As does my next guest, Seana Smith, who migrated to Australia from Scotland, but went to various places along the way and chatted to me about some of her experiences living abroad as well.
I often think that I'm actually not really a great traveller, but I do love going and living in other places. I think the longest I ever went backpacking was about 3 months, but I have lived in Italy for a year before I went to uni, and then we lived in Pakistan for a year before we came to Australia. Then, of course, we've lived in Australia for 20 years. And then I've also lived in that most unusual and exotic country, England, which is just south of Scotland. And I went to university there, and I remember thinking, actually, this is another country when I was there. And I think all the time, even though I've been in Australia now for 20 years, it still is new. I don't have that long history here. And there are so many places I've never gone to. But I sometimes wonder now whether I'll go and live somewhere else again, or whether I wouldn't be able to because I've got these 4 children, and I just don't know whether I'd be able to. I would love to go and live somewhere else for a year. I would love to. I'd like to go to Oman for a year. I'd quite like to go to one of the Pacific Islands for a year. But I really don't know whether I'll be able to. I'd actually quite like to go to Europe for a year somewhere. Or Scotland. I'd probably go anywhere. But I think that experience of going to Italy when I was young, and I was an au pair there, the world's worst au pair, as it turned out. But that was really influential for me because I really did get to know a lot more than I ever would have done if I'd gone there for a shorter time. And the same when we went to Pakistan, although that was it was difficult in lots of ways because I was there with a new baby and I didn't know what I was doing, and the baby wasn't behaving the way you'd expect. And I found my life, because I was a memsab, my husband was working, it was very restricted, but it was still so interesting, partly because you read the papers every day and you can go exploring from your own home. I think I do like having my own home, but I like going off from it.
It's good to have
So
a
I don't.
base, isn't it? Just that makes a
Yeah,
lot of things easier, and you can be
yeah,
very slow in your travels then, or your
yeah, yeah,
explorations, because it's just,
yeah,
it doesn't have to be every day or all day every day.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And you can keep your routine at home. So I know you've lived overseas as well, haven't you, a few times? So, and I would love to do it again.
Oh, I would love to do it again too. It seems very pie in the sky to imagine living abroad at this moment when we can't even travel abroad from Australia. But I know this phase won't last forever. And, well, who knows where I'll be in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. Who knows? The world is still out there. Anyway, someone who has moved abroad and has been living in France for 14 years now is Penny Walker, who lives in the Pyrenees there. And we had a really good chat about a lot of the differences between visiting somewhere and actually living there.
As I say, I've lived in the Pyrenees for nearly 14 years now. Previously, I'd visited, spent maybe a week at a time visiting the Pyrenees and other areas of France as well. And obviously, the main difference is the depth of knowledge, the depth of experience, the wealth of information about local communities, about the local environment, the people, the ways of life, the culture, history. That can only really be gained through a prolonged spell in a particular destination. It's a case of exploring beyond the superficial, getting to the heart, really the beating heart of the area for me that I've chosen to live in. It takes many years to really experience the destination. When you visit, you can only scrape the surface. And it's a really valuable, life-changing thing to spend a prolonged period of time in a particular place. It really is life-changing.
Oh, it's absolutely life-changing. I agree. Do you think after this many years, do you still approach it as with the sort of the wonder of it not being where you grew up or of it being a new place?
Yeah, many people do ask me, don't you ever take it for granted? Do you not take that special mountain environment for granted, having lived there for as long as you have? And every time my answer is the same. It's a categorical, goodness me, no. How could you take such a special environment, a special destination for granted? I'm discovering things about the area all the time, whether it's about Pyrenees life, whether it's about the language, whether it's about the culture, the food. It's an ongoing learning process that never fails to enrich my life. And the other big thing about the Pyrenees, which is so enriching and which you can only really appreciate if you spend a great deal of time here, is the two country aspect of it. We've got Spain and France bang next door to each other. We can literally pop along the Aran Valley into Spain to do some shopping, funnily enough. And it feels like you're on holiday. Every time I go across the border into Spain, it feels like I'm on holiday. And there is so much more to explore and to discover on both sides of the chain, the length of the chain. It's an ongoing, wonderful learning experience that is seriously life enriching. And I can't recommend it highly enough.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yes, living on a border is something particularly special, isn't it? I know I've visited my some relatives in Basel frequently, and the idea of I've been with them many times. They pop into Germany to go to dinner or to go to the shops, and it's still, coming from Australia where you can't drive to anywhere, it's especially interesting always to think of those borders. Now I wonder if I could get you to cast your mind back to your first year or two living in the Pyrenees. Were there pros and cons at the time? Were there any teething difficulties settling in, or how did that go?
The early years were interesting, shall we say. I think I made the mistake of buying a property with my heart rather than using my head, which is, I think, an issue with many, many people who buy overseas. In hindsight, I would have rented somewhere for a year in a certain location before actually buying, in order to ascertain that it was actually going to be the right environment, the right situation, the right property before settling there. It was a difficult initial period because we bought a property that was in an idyllic situation, a mountain situation. It was the most beautiful environment, the most spectacular views. But from a practical point of view, it was not the right place to be for living permanently. It was too off-grid, it was too remote, too isolated. It was half an hour to get down to the nearest town, up over a hill, up over a big col. It was not right for a number of practical reasons, and it was stressful, to be honest with you. Beautiful initially, it was like, oh wow, we've got this most beautiful place and a wonderful environment, but yeah, I mean, reality set in after probably a couple of years. So yeah, we made a decision to look elsewhere, to find somewhere that was still in the Pyrenees but more accessible, less isolated, that had the whole combination of factors that we should have looked for initially, such as the right environment for the various sports that we wanted to do, the road cycling in particular. Because when you live in an isolated mountain environment, you've got to go either up or down a hill. You can't just head out on your bike and go for a 50-kilometre ride. You have to go up a great big hill. And that was no fun.
No, it's not very motivating to think you've got to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, second time around, we did rent a property for a number of months to make sure that was the right situation for what we were looking for the life we wanted to lead. And thank goodness we did, because we stumbled across the most amazing property that ticked all our boxes, that was in the perfect location with the mountains literally 20 minutes up the road, with the autoroute and the town 15-20 minutes down the road, easy accessibility to everywhere that we needed to access. It's simply the most perfect environment that we would not have probably discovered unless we had have rented for a period of time. So that would be my big piece of advice to anybody looking to relocate, is do not buy off the cuff because you have a coup de coeur, because you fall in love with a particular property that you found on a website or via an agent. Do rent and make sure it is the right environment for you.
That sounds very sensible. What about fitting in with the local people? How did that go?
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I've always spoken French. I love the French and the French language. And I absolutely relished getting to know the local people, getting to know their way of life. And it's been a seriously enriching experience. It really has. It's a very special element of moving to any country, is getting integrated into local life. Yeah, absolutely.
Some very handy tips there if you are considering a move abroad, I think, that Penny has learnt from her experience. And also that all-important part about getting to know local people. I love doing that when we travel. And really, as we discussed, the best way is to be there for years. You can't replicate that same connection as a short-term visitor. So, really makes me homesick for all my other homes, having put together this episode. But it's something to think about for the future, and it's nice to, look back on how living in other countries has been different from travelling there, and thinking about, what I've learnt from that and how it's changed me. And I hope that some of you feel the same. If you have lived abroad and have something to mention about it, come over to the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. There's a link in the show notes, or just search Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook and let us know what your experience of living abroad was like and why that's different, and what's sort of special about it compared to travelling there. So a huge thank you to my fabulous guests for today's episode. First up, I chatted with Flip Byrnes, and you can find more about Flip on her Instagram profile at The Adventure Mama. Also, big thanks to Seana Smith. Seana runs a website called Hello Sydney Kids, and you can find that at hellosydneykids.com.au. And finally, I chatted with Penny Walker of Adventure Creators, and you can find more about her Pyrenees experiences and tours at adventurecreators.com. All of these links and more information will be in the show notes. For this episode, the show notes are at notaballerina.com/229. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.